Well, hello, everyone. My name is Bill Johnson with AppGeo, and in today's presentation, we want to talk a little bit about strategic planning and why we think it's one of the most valuable things that a GIO can do. I'm, as many of you know, was the GIO for the state of New York. I was Frank Winter's predecessor in that role. And one of the things I loved about being GIO was the great breadth of it. GIS touches so many disciplines and can provide goodness and solutions to so many problems out there. And that's a kind of a two-edged sword, because all of these issues look like things that you should devote time and energy to, and you can be easily overwhelmed with all of the demands on your time. And that's the value for strategic planning, in my experience, is that it provides focus and clarity on the things that really are worth your energy and focus. So that's what we want to do this afternoon here, is introduce you to the colleagues that if you were to select AppGeo to do a strategic plan in your area, these are the folks that you'd be working with. I'm going to be one at a time asking each of them a question to give you a bit of a feel for what the issues are that we touch on in these plans and why it should matter to you. Now, just one quick piece of background. A strategic plan lays out what you should be doing, and generally results in the form of a small number of strategic priorities that should guide your activities for the next 3 to 5 years. There's a separate document called a business plan, for which each of those goals can have a business plan, and it defines how you get there to achieve those goals. So I just wanted to be clear about that. We're talking about the strategic plan, that visionary piece that lays out the priorities. So let's get right into it. I'm going to be introducing you to my colleagues, and I'm going to start with Jim Sparks. Jim is the former GIO for the state of Indiana. That's a job he had for more than a decade before he retired and handed over the reins to Megan Compton, the current GIO. And Jim was responsible for the development of a strategic plan while he was Indiana GIO. And now Megan has hired AppGeo, and Jim has been on the team working on a new strategic plan for Indiana. So Jim, you've been on both sides of the equation here, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on strategic planning from that perspective of both sides.
Sure, you bet, Bill, and thanks. And you're right, as GIO, I had created a strategic plan for the office and later updated the plan before leaving that position. So with that said, I'd like to invite everyone in the audience to think for a moment about the difference between creating a state geographic information office from scratch like I did versus inheriting a giant box of moving parts and relationships like Megan did, along with the expectation that all those parts have to keep moving and all those relationships need to keep growing while other new relationships are formed. In my mind, Megan had the more difficult situation, but she also had a couple of things to help her get started. One of those was an outgoing GIO who was very happy to be a soundboard and a brainstorming partner. But the other was the original and then an updated strategic plan that laid out goals and recommendations to run the office. Those plans, in addition to outlining strategies, also provided history and context that's useful in understanding how the office got to its present situation. 2 early pieces of advice I offered Megan. 1, make this office and this position yours. You bring a unique profile to this job, so adjust the way the office is run to match your profile, and promote goals and initiatives that you think are important. She's done this very, very well, by the way. 2, try to focus on no more than 3 to 5 big ideas at any given time. Now, this is really hard for a GIO to do, because what I was really saying was grab 3 to 5 ideas out of a bag of 100 ideas and give those your full attention in a way that you can't with the rest, even while recognizing that all of them have importance. So she moved forward with that advice and her own common sense and hired the AppGeo team to partner with her to create a new 5-year strategic plan. The result is a plan that reflects her view of how the office should function and what it should accomplish under her leadership. In other words, the result is her plan. So thinking about all of this, here are some takeaways. Strategic plans represent the outcome of a deliberate and extensive effort to chart an optimum path forward. In addition, strategic plans will eventually serve as important historical documents that can provide a valuable understanding to successors as well as current and future stakeholders about the evolution of the office. Strategic plans are critical given the many demands of a state GIO to give full focus and attention to a manageable set of priorities. And finally, a strategic plan should carry the thumbprint of the GIO as its primary architect.
Thank you, Jim. We're going to turn now to Kate Hickey. Kate is the Chief Operating Officer at AppGeo, and Kate has worked on a great many strategic plans for many states going back more than 15 years. And in fact, I don't think there's anybody in the U.S. that's worked on more of these GIS strategic plans than you, Kate. And so my question to you is, what's different now from what you saw when these plans were kind of the first generation of these strategic plans from what's happening today? And what are those themes that have remained constant in the plans now?
Yeah. From 2009 to 2013 was the core time when AppGeo was working on a lot of these plans. During that period, I think we worked in over 40 states on strategic plans and follow-on business plans. And these were funded by the FGDC CAP grants, the Cooperative Agreement Program. And so they were funding states with the goal of helping them establish GIS programs and really build spatial data infrastructure. So, the funding was build the infrastructure at the state, and that will roll up into the national spatial data infrastructure. And at that time, a lot of the effort was on educating the community that there wasn't an established geospatial community in all of these states. A lot of it was going around and explaining to local governments and others, why this technology and this data and these initiatives is important, and why their role in this process is important, and how they can contribute to a national spatial data infrastructure and how they will benefit from that. And now I would say that, the latest round, 15 years later, and this isn't a round that's coming from the FGDC, this is really driven by the needs of each GIO or each GIS leader that we're working with in the state. And it's much more driven by their unique needs. It's much more about evaluating and recalibrating and improving what's already been established and preparing for what's going to come. We all know that technology just keeps changing faster and faster. And so a lot of the concern that we hear is about preparation for the technology changes that are coming. The programs that Jim and others and you built, these have matured, and the technology is now ubiquitous. So many of the questions that are being asked in this current set of plans is, okay, what's working and what's not? Who's benefiting from this state asset and who's not benefiting, who's not using it? And then, of course, how can we prepare for the future? Or even how can we make decisions better as a program? How can we govern ourselves and collaborate and cooperate better to make better decisions? This was, I've quoted Matt Peters a number of times when I think about this latest round of strategic planning. And when we started working with him, he said, my primary goal is to reach the unusual suspects. I want to touch those who are still out there in the state who are not using GIS every day. I don't want these workshops and these interviews to be focused on those who understand everything about it and who are already benefiting greatly. He wanted to go deeper, and he knew that those questions that would be explored through the planning process would have to be nuanced enough to reach those other people. So I think that encapsulates my perspective on what's changed.
Great, thank you. I'm going to turn now to a colleague that many of you, if you haven't done a project with AppGeo, may not have met previously, and that's Michele Giorgianni. And Michele, youthful as she appears, actually has 20 years experience in GIS, 15 of them with AppGeo. And for much of that time, she's been working a lot with our local government clients, cities, towns, counties, and regional groups. And more recently, she has been the team leader, project manager on our three most recent and current ongoing plans with Indiana, Montana, and now Michigan. And so, Michele, what I'd like to hear from you is, how are you seeing the relationship between the GIO and these local stakeholders, the local government folks that you know so well?
I think that the vantage point that I have now, after working with all these different levels of government, has really broadened my horizons, and that now I can see and I can more clearly understand the needs from both sides, and how they relate and how they impact each other. Whereas before I had the viewpoint of local govs, counties, regional. So this has been really eye-opening for me and given me more insights. Because of that, I can now empathize with all the sides, if you want to call them sides. So the local government stakeholders, they have a list of geospatial needs that are really vast and very varied. And sometimes they're really specific or really nuanced. And it could depend too on how many or which departments within a local government have committed to using GIS in their day-to-day work. From my perspective, supporting one municipality or partnering with one municipality is like working with 5 or even 10 different customers, because you'll have assessors, planners, engineering, public works, IT, schools, clerks, police, fire, and their public, to name some of them. So, for an example might be the departments might even have a different need when it comes to what imagery specifications they might need as far as currentness or frequency or accuracy or resolution to suit their purpose for their projects. And of course, those specifications could be different than what the state might provision, because they're trying to solve for the most common denominator to support the broadest array of use cases as cost effectively as possible. So totally two perspectives there. The other thing that I'm seeing is a little bit of oversimplification. Kate gave me that word. Thanks, Kate. Of each other when it comes to communications and coordination. So for instance, when you're planning communications with municipalities to keep them apprised of GIO activities, or saying that you partner with County X, who is the contact at County X? There's really not like just one phone number or email address for County X. An example would be if you've been partnering with the PSAPs on provisioning boundaries. Yes, technically County X is a partner because of that coordination work, but there's tons more potential partnering that could be done with County X because of all those customers that exist within County X. And if your main point of contact is the lead GIS person at the county, it could be better, but unless they're doing a super stellar coordination within their organization, it's likely that some messaging isn't getting to the full breadth of the potential stakeholders there. And likewise, on the flip side, counties and cities and towns, they often refer to the state as one entity, yet the state is a very large organization with many departments and divisions too. And the state has this huge job of coordinating within itself for all the varied needs across all the different departments. But plus add in the fact that in a federated model, which is used quite often, there's a lot of geospatial work being done or decisions being made, and that's spread out across all the different state departments. And now add on coordinating outside of the state to all the other stakeholders, including local government. So that effort to effectively communicate and coordinate with the entire community is humongous and can't really be done in an ad hoc fashion. It really requires a plan. And we've seen this in these recent plans. It requires a focus, it requires templates, it requires schedules, defined communication channels and methods and audiences and content and messaging. And it requires strategies for how you're going to handle incoming communications. So we recently worked with Montana State Library to develop a business plan after the strategic planning project. And that business plan focuses on how to improve their communications. And so now we're also working with Indiana's GIO to develop a business plan for them that'll give them guidance and framework to ultimately build a communication plan. So the theme is there. We may see it in Michigan too when we get to that point. And these business plans, though, are a result of the goals that we determined in the strategic planning process that explained that improved communications and ultimately a communication plan is actually needed. So while the business plan is explaining how to improve the communications and develop a communication plan. So going back to what you were saying earlier, Bill, about the difference between a strategic plan and business plan. So ultimately, a communication plan that'll come after the business plan will define details, really, like specific staff, communication tasks, messages, the delivery schedule of those messages, what's actually going to be performed on a day-to-day operational basis. So I've been seeing this theme. I think it's important. Communication is obviously one of the most important things that GIOs can do. And so having a plan that helps you focus on that is really beneficial.
Well, thank you, Michele. And finally, but certainly not least, I want to introduce you to Eric Ingbar. Eric is a senior consultant with AppGeo and has been working on strategic plans with us now for several years. And he lives in near Reno, Nevada. And when Nevada did a strategic plan some years ago, Eric was involved on the client side of this equation and saw this actually not as the buyer of a strategic plan, but as a stakeholder in Nevada. And so, Eric, I wonder now what your thoughts are about engaging the stakeholder community in the process of developing these plans. In other words, Eric, what's the value of strategic planning kind of at street level, if you will?
Thanks, Bill. Well, we've heard a lot about the importance of strategic planning when it comes to government operations, really at all levels, like Michele mentioned and Kate alluded to as well. But I think at the street level, ultimately, stakeholders are not limited to other government entities. All government entities ultimately work for the public, and thus the stakeholders necessarily include academia, the private sector professionals, and more the citizenry at large, all of whom have an expectation that maps and geographic data and the kind of online goodness and smart government that geographic data makes possible will be part of the services that they receive from their government at all levels. So consequently, I think you need to think about strategic planning as having stakeholders that are truly at the street level. But there's more to it than this. The strategic planning process, and I say this as both a participant on the street side, on the stakeholder side, and as someone who participates and is part of planning processes themselves, the formation of these strategic plans, it's a learning event for everybody involved. And you heard this from Jim, you heard this from Kate, you heard it from Michele, which is you cannot go into a strategic planning process without assessing where your community, and I mean community in the broadest sense, thus including the public, is in terms of its wants, desires, and needs for geospatial data. So there's a great amount of learning that happens really on both sides of that, both from the GIO perspective, kind of touching base with the broad constituency that's out there, and that is forever coming up with new and novel and interesting ways to use geospatial data. And from the public's perspective, or the stakeholder perspective, the street level, of knowing, here's what a GIO does. I would bet you that if we went around to all the various GIS professional organizations in the nation, and we asked at their state level meetings, give me a sentence, or which of the following sentences apply to what a GIO does? And we had a choice of, I don't know. That I don't know would probably be the overwhelmingly largest response that we got. Mm-hmm. And I think that many of us at the street level really don't understand what GIOs do, or that GIOs, and as Kate mentioned, in this kind of second round of strategic planning, are more and more integral to the provisioning of enterprise level, state level data that's authoritative and that is high quality. And that is ultimately what the street level wants, right? Is data, and data, whether that data comes as data sets, as data services, or as applications, right? They're consumers. So, what's the value of the strategic planning process? Even in places like Nevada, the value is that it ensures that government is truly meeting the broadest needs of stakeholders when we consider them in the broadest sense.
All right. Well, thank you for that. Hope this has been useful to you to hear perspectives from our panelists. I want to remind you that NISJIC is in 2 weeks. Kate and I, and actually a third AppGeo colleague, Mo Coleman, who is not on this panel, will all be there and look forward to talking with you there. And happy to go a lot deeper about what a strategic plan might mean for you as well. Thank you.